It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Liberal Democrat MP Leila Moran, Daily Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant and Miata Famboule from the left of centre think tank The New Economics Foundation. Today, do patients need to see a GP face-to-face?
In cases where it's clear that the patient should be seen face-to-face, it's important that the patient is given a choice.
It's really difficult to say, well, I've got this pain and it's here. And you can't really show somebody where here is over the phone.
GP surgeries are currently under siege. We are unbelievably busy.
Should young people be afraid of climate change?
We are seeing a rise in climate anxiety.
With bin strikes continuing in Brighton, we'll talk about public sector pay. And will children be reassured by this?
I'm confident there'll be a good amount of Christmas presents available for everyone to buy.
Well, you heard the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and saw him in the headlines there. He's in Washington for the G7 finance ministers meeting, discussing, amongst other things, supply chain problems. Let's just show you a couple of the front pages. On this shortages crisis, says the Mirror, rush to save Xmas. And this is how the Express are covering it. Get your skates on for a happy Christmas. Madeline, you heard Rishi Sunak say, I'm confident there'll be a good amount of Christmas presents available for everyone to buy. Does that reassure you?
Absolutely not, because there has been some form in saying don't panic and it having the absolutely opposite effect. But equally, I feel for politicians, because when they're asked to reassure people, saying anything at all whatsoever seems to send people into a spiral of panic. So you can't really win in this situation. Right,
well, let's just show you some pictures here, because we were talking about problems at the port of Felixstowe here a few days ago. But let's have a look at these pictures. This is of boats stacking up in huge numbers, as you can see, outside the port of Los Angeles. Miata, do you think these supply chain issues are just going to keep flaring up constantly over the winter?
I think, unfortunately, they are. And it's important to say, as the government's been pointing out, that there are supply chain issues across the world. But I do think that they are markedly worse in this country. And they're markedly worse in part because we have a government that seems to relish presiding over chaos and seems incapable to have horizon scanning, looking forward and planning properly for the things that we know are coming down the track. And there's a Brexit impact as well. You know, if you go back to the HGV driver shortages, its roots stem in the fact that, yes, there was a shortage anyway, but we embarked on Brexit and the government didn't plan for what was clearly going to happen despite the warnings from business. So, yes, there is a problem that's a global problem, but it is much, much worse in this country because our government seems to be completely incapable of getting a grip.
Bim?
I don't think Miata's right about that.
Which bit?
Well, frankly, all of it. If we go first of all, in terms of the global supply chain issue, yes, it is a completely global problem, we should acknowledge that. And it is not worse in this country. You've actually seen, you've shown me evidence of what's happening in the United States, and not just in Los Angeles, by the way, in many states in North America, in many parts of North America. In relation to HGV drivers, they have shortages of HGV drivers in Europe as well, which didn't have Brexit. And critically, the biggest impact on HGV drivers, it's the industry not paying them well enough. In 2010, the difference between HGV drivers' salary and an average salary was about 60%. Now, rather 2019, pre-COVID, it was 32%. If you don't pay people well enough to do the job, there's no surprise that lots of people leave. It's a very complicated issue, but it is not worse in this country. What the government's now trying to do, along with, frankly, governments all over the world, is to try and get on top of the issue and try and sort it out. But it is a difficult, global, very complicated problem.
Leila, you want to respond, no doubt, to what you've heard there from Bim, but is there also a problem of panic buying? Do you blame people for panic buying?
Actually, I actually don't. And my experience of the people I've been speaking to isn't panic buying as such. It's looking across at what they think they and their families need, noticing that the government is failing on very basic things, getting the brand that they like in the supermarket, getting fuel onto the forecourts, and they're making a decision to stock up a bit so that they can weather it through. I don't think that's a panic. Actually, I think that's a very rational choice made by rational people at irrational behaviour from the government, because yes, BIM, it is partly to do specifically with conditions in this country. If you speak to people who are living on the continent in particular, there are issues, but they're not manifesting in people in their homes noticing them. And that means that there's parts of the market that are stepping in and softening that blow. And one of the things, of course, is recruitment. We learned just in the last 24 hours that 20 HGV drivers have made the application. That's to fill the 100,000 vacancies we have. Okay. This was predictable. And yes, there are other pressures out there, but we have to now take a cold, hard look at the offer we're making to those HGV drivers from perhaps Eastern European countries who decided to leave and we now want to come back. Okay. By the time they get recruited, is 2 months a contract enough? And blaming business, I don't see what that achieves, frankly.
Right. Just before I get you to respond, I just wanted to ask you, Madeleine, this idea that perhaps some industries and some sectors would like people to go out and perhaps buy early ahead of Christmas. Do you think that could be a motivation?
I don't know enough to comment on that specifically. I do think we genuinely need to be quite careful about what we say around this issue, because there have been instances where what wasn't really much of a shortage to begin with was then massively precipitated, and it didn't take much in terms of individual behaviour changes for there suddenly to be a shortage of petrol, for these things suddenly to have a knock-on effect. So I think we do have to be careful, and with things like the clogs at the Fort of Felixstowe right now, I mean, already port authorities are saying that things are looking a bit better. They're saying that some of the bigger shippers are diverting to other ports. So I think it's a bit too early to say. Things might clear up quicker than we think.
All right, but there is some news just before, Bim, you do respond. We are expecting an announcement, possibly about short-term visas for abattoir workers. So shortages in other sectors, not just HGV lorries, Bim.
Yes, of course. And look, where Layla is correct is that we do need to look at this in a cold, hard, analytical way and look at different parts of the labour market and how we can improve things. It's important that we don't just say, let's raid other countries for as many of their workers as we can, because A, that has all sorts of impacts on those countries, but in this country, that's a short-term solution. I think the long-term solutions are the ones we need to be reaching for. In particular, it's pay, it's conditions, it's the structure of those industries, it's how we use automation and technology as well. And if we can do that, we actually build a better economy for the future, and that's really what we've got to be trying to do, even at a time of real stress.
Very brief response, Miata, from you before we move on.
So no one is going to dispute the fact that we need to be increasing pay in certain sectors. You know, we have presided over a decade in which average wages have not budged. So that has to be an imperative. But, you know, you have to also manage a crisis. And what you cannot do is have shortages that then have knock-on effect. And so we see inflation, we see price rises, we see a cost of living crisis, because that has an impact on the very people that, you know, you promised that you'd help. You'd promised that actually some of the changes that would come in place as a consequence of Brexit would make their lives better. So there is a short-term problem I think you're going to have to deal with, and at the same time as trying to deal with the structural problems. No one is ever going to say, don't deal with the structural problems. We have to, but you've also got to fix the short term.
Let's talk about GPs. The front page of the Daily Mail, their campaign, GPs, the new face-to-face revolution, talking about league tables and money from the government to help GP practices. We'll talk about the substance of what the government has announced in a moment. But first of all, Bim, how important is it really for patients to see their GPs face-to-face?
I think for a lot of patients, it's very important. Not for everybody, because there are many who have found working remotely with their GP, they find that a positive thing as well. But I was speaking to constituents earlier on this week and to GPs, and they were saying, it is important that we offer more face-to-face. This extra money will help support that. But at the same time, we also need to support the GPs offering that, because they've been operating under difficulties as well. They've had various restrictions that have how their practices operate that have continued longer than they have in the rest of society. We need to get things more back to normal to support the GPs. We're giving them some extra funds, And we need to also make sure that GPs do offer those face-to-face consultations for people that want them.
Do you agree, Layla, if we look at the figures, 80% pre-pandemic, 80% of appointments face-to-face, it dropped to 54%, it's now back up to 58%. Do you agree with what Bim says about the importance of those face-to-face appointments?
Well, I've been talking to doctors here locally, and I'm sure many MPs are getting written to about this. Actually, what I'm hearing from constituents is many of them quite like the online appointments, especially if they're younger, more mobile, and they'd rather not take the time to travel there, wait in the waiting room, etc. So it suits them. But certainly for particularly some of my more elderly constituents who are more complex in their needs, they found it deeply frustrating. But the way to tackle this, in my view, is not to bash GPs. There is a narrative that is in part precipitated by some of the right-wing press and indeed parts of government that suggests that GPs haven't been working incredibly hard, but they have. They are, in fact, many of them on their knees, and many of them are now voting with their feet and choosing to leave the profession. There are nearly 1,000 who left the profession over the last 12 months. So there is a more systemic problem, coming back to this idea of, if let's fix the problem at its core. Well, GP numbers have been falling regularly for the last 6 years, not going up as had been promised. And that fundamentally is the core of the problem. We need to be training more GPs. There is no magic locum tree where we can suddenly recruit GPs from some room somewhere that they've all been hiding. It's just simply not the case. And so I'm glad the money's there. I'm glad the government's now appreciated that GPs need extra money and support to continue to support us, but we've got a winter crisis coming, and unfortunately I don't think this is going to make a palpable difference. We've got bigger play here.
Right, GP bashing, is that what's going on here, Madeleine?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I think this has often been driven by members of the public who can see how the service they've received, they can see how things have not been diagnosed. There are some truly horrific stories that have come out over the last year, and I think we're now beginning to grasp the consequences. And that needn't be bashing GPs. Obviously, in a crisis, things often have to be done differently, and we, in hindsight, look back and think maybe that was a mistake. It doesn't need to be a finger-pointing exercise, but I think it's wrong to suggest this is a hysteria that's been whipped up by the right-wing press or purely by Tory politicians. Many people feel that they are not receiving an adequate service, and I agree with Layla that perhaps there is a more systemic problem here. It seems to me that perhaps the old primary care model is no longer fit for purpose at a time when you have a great deal of part-time work amongst GPs and a real struggle with recruitment. I mean, I'm not convinced that that model can really survive so much anymore. And if there's some way that the various parties involved can, I don't know, come together and talk about it in a less sort of blamey way, then that would be great.
Layla, do you want to respond?
Well, I think I agree, certainly, with working together and collegiality across politics. It's very much what I stand for. But unfortunately, I do think that some of this has been extra pressure put on GPs, suggesting that they're not working hard enough. And that has come from many different sources. And GPs are telling me that it's making them think again about whether or not they want to extend their retirement. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need. So I think actually the best thing that we can all do, including government, is thank GPs, like we have done for all key workers and essential workers, for what they've had to do extra during this pandemic. Absolutely, this money may help, but also to listen to GPs about how they can improve conditions in their own practices to be able to recruit. And I'm sorry, this does partly come back to Brexit. There were many European doctors who used to work here and decided that they weren't welcome anymore and left, and this is partly what's caused some of this problem.
All right, well, let's have a listen to one GP, Dr. Rosemary Leonard. Here she is.
Unfortunately, many patients think they need to be seen when actually they can be dealt with much more efficiently over the phone. And GP surgeries are currently under siege. We are unbelievably busy, and we're kind of being expected, expected to be superhuman.
I'm going to come to you, Miata, in just one moment. Bim, what did you want to say?
Look, I'm son of a doctor. I've got huge amounts of time and respect for GPs, but it's very important that the GPs know that they are there to serve the patients. And when the lady said, oh, well, some people think they want to be seen, but they don't really need to be. Well, I like to put the patient first. And if the patient wants face-to-face, we should prioritise that. We should make sure that is a real priority, because I think that what we cannot be doing as a system, and the NHS or in the primary care system is saying to people, no, you don't need to be seen. We'll deal with you the way we want to deal with you. That's the wrong way around.
Right.
And I think that we need to, of course, we need to support GPs. And by the way, we're bringing forward measures to stop the abuse of GPs or anything like that, because that's disgraceful. And we need to support them. That's why we're giving them extra money. We need to recruit more doctors. That's why we need to do that. Well, but at the same time, we do need to accept, and the profession needs to accept, that face-to-face appointments for a large number of people is very important.
Right, Miata, patients first before GPs?
Look, I think you can get to a balance of face-to-face and virtual. You know, I personally prefer virtual, and I think it's right that we have that balance. But I think the bigger issue is the £250 million that the government has announced is a drop in the ocean, because at the heart of this is the fact that we have chronic underinvestment in our health service, including GP services. There's huge amounts of pressure, and the capacity that we need to respond is not there, partly because a lot of people have left. You know, the government promised us 6,000 new doctors. 1,800 GPs have left the practice since 2015. So there is a bigger problem. And again, this feels like the government not really getting to grips with the scale of the crisis that's facing. Therefore, they're not taking the level of action that they need to. And in 6 months' time, they'll be looking back and saying, oh, yet another crisis that we've managed to mess up.
I mean, isn't that true, Bim?
No, it's not. It's true to say that there are very deep structural issues with recruitment of doctors.
Right.
I think the point Madeline made earlier around the primary care system and how we ensure that we can keep people in primary care for longer with an increase in people taking part-time and various other structural changes. We have a partnership model, which a lot of people in modern day don't necessarily want to buy into a partnership and buy all the, the property involved with it. You know, there's a very complicated set of issues.
But is there a recruitment problem in the way Miata says, and yet you want doctors to have more face-to-face appointments? Yeah. There is this issue with a shortage of doctors at the moment. What did Layla call it? The locum magic tree?
Well, of course, we need to recruit more doctors, but even if you recruit more doctors today, then it still takes time for that to come through. So there are long-term things that we need to be doing. And in the short term, what do we need to do? Put the patients first and give the GPs that financial and other support that they need in order to do that.
Miata?
Well, yes, of course, but GPs will put the patient first. I think it's, slightly disrespectful to assume, to even suggest that they're not doing that.
No,
the argument that's being made by the profession is we are under our knees, there is a huge capacity problem, and your £250 million is quite frankly completely inadequate and slightly insulting. There is a crisis that you must get a grip on. There is a crisis that you must confront and start coming up with some proper solutions for us to be able to respond. Because at the moment, they feel like the government is letting them down.
Bim?
Well, what we're doing is last year we recruited the highest number of doctors ever, but of course that will take time to feed through. We're giving this extra support money. By all means, if in 6 months' time it needs that GPs need more support in order to offer these more face-to-face appointments, then that's what should happen. I'm not saying this £250 million is it for that regard, but ultimately we need to prevail upon the system to say, how can we get to the right mixture of technology for often younger, more mobile people who want to do things remotely, but also offering the face-to-face for people who want that as well. We need to work with GPs in order to do this. We shouldn't have a sort of fight between, we've got to work together.
Right.
And if we can do that correctly, then I'm optimistic about how things will turn out.
Layla, is that you trying to come in?
Yes, I mean, just to quickly say, we need to also remember GPs don't exist in a vacuum. And the pressures that lie in the wider NHS, the biggest number of people waiting for a hospital appointment ever now, 5.7 million people waiting, that has an effect, because if there's a newly diagnosed condition that the GP may well have diagnosed, whether it was online or face-to-face, if that patient isn't able to then go and get the care they need after that point, they're going to keep coming back into surgeries and things are going to get more and more complex. Mental health needs being a really good example of an area that's been chronically underfunded and no sign that that's going to get any better anytime soon. In fact, very likely it's going to get worse. So I think we see this in its context. I think GPs are doing the very best. I think they are putting their patients first.
Okay.
But I also agree that we just need more in the system and the government's not delivering that.
Madeline, I know you wanted to come in just briefly before we move on.
Sure. I mean, I agree. I think GPs do want to do the best for their patients, but they're also individuals themselves who respond to incentives. And I would much prefer, rather than chucking yet more money at the NHS, the government has pumped huge sums into the NHS without any sign of any reforms such that the NHS will claim an ever larger share of public funding with no guarantee that things will get better. Are there reforms that could be considered that, for example, would incentivise GPs towards full-time work rather than part-time work? Are there ways that they could flip the structure? Are there ways they could start getting people to co-pay more for their appointments? These sorts of reforms are just not even being considered in the conversation. I think it's to our detriment.
Well, those are big things to talk about another time, a big conversation to be had about reform of the NHS. We're going to talk about the environment and climate because the BBC's Adam Fleming, my colleague, has been speaking to the Duke of Cambridge for Newscast, the podcast ahead of the first Earthshot Prize to reward those trying to save the planet. Let's have a listen.
We are seeing a rise in climate anxiety. You know, young people now are growing up where their futures are basically being threatened the whole time. It's very unnerving and it's very, anxiety-making.
You saw Adam Fleming there at the end. You can watch the full newscast interview with Prince William on BBC One at 11:35 this evening, and the full podcast is available now on BBC Sounds. I think I've got that all right. Layla, referring back to the comments there by Prince William, is he right?
Well, I can assure you that I am relatively young, but share those anxieties, and I completely understand why young people are. Some have been writing into me saying exactly this. COP26, which is meant to be sort of the last chance saloon, particularly for some nations who are absolutely going to be on their knees unless we can keep within 1.5 degrees of warning. This is the last chance, and it looks like it's going to be not as ambitious as we'd like it to be. And I can see why. The government has been, I think, not putting its full weight behind this, because whilst Alok Sharma has been going around the world meeting with people, they then look to the UK and they say, well, actually, what are you doing yourself? And what they're doing is they've been cutting aid to the very same countries that are going to be using that aid in order to implement these climate targets. What they've been doing is not giving them the vaccines and the technology transfer and the TRIPS waiver and all the rest of it that would give them the chance to bolster their economies. And meanwhile, they're drilling for oil in Surrey, cutting the Green Homes grants and cutting grants to electric vehicles. I mean, do as I say and not as I do seems to be the modus operandi of this government. And it's no surprise to me that COP is looking really precarious at the moment.
All right, well, Bim, you'll want to respond to some of that. But this particular issue about whether, Layla says she's feeling anxious, should young people be feeling anxious about the environment and fear for their futures, or does the language or some of the rhetoric need to be dialed down? Bim?
I think that, look, I'm a huge fan of Prince William's, and he does fantastic work on this and on many other things. I don't think that young people should become anxious in this way, because though we have great challenges, there are great opportunities and there's a huge amount of work going on so that we can solve those challenges. And I think that...
Not according to Layla.
Well, I mean, I can't respond to everything, but beyond to say that I think she very, very poorly mischaracterises the government's efforts in this arena that are world renowned for our ambition and our achievements so far. But what I think young people, who will be maybe watching this and thinking about this issue and what they can do, get involved. Get involved, whether it be in political parties, get involved with campaign groups to say, these are the practical steps we need to take in order to achieve the goals that we need to have. Because if you can get involved and you have much more agency over it and put pressure on people like me and indeed on other members of the public, that's when anxiety diminishes and that's when real progress is made. And I think that's what I would urge young people to do. I wouldn't urge young people to sit and say, look, there's nothing I can do and I'm going to be terribly anxious for years because my future's taken away from me. Seize hold of that future and see if you can make a positive difference.
Well, Miata, I'm showing, I know you can't see it, but I'll read it to you. We're showing this front page, it is, of an advert, Extinction Rebellion UK, and it says, advice to young people as they face annihilation. Is that reasonable?
Well, so look, I wouldn't use those languages, but I think it's really hard to say to young people, you shouldn't feel anxious about this, because they do feel anxious about it. And the reason they do is because they can see the scale of the challenge, they can see the impact it will have on their future, and they look at the political leadership, both in this country, but quite frankly, worldwide, and it is woefully inadequate. There's a big chasm between the rhetoric around getting to net zero quickly and the action that's actually been taken. And the fact that we could be looking at, COP and the prospects of it feel quite low, I think is all the indictment that we need. You know, we've been told by the scientists, they've been really consistent on this. We have less than a decade to take drastic action to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. We know it is coming. We know we're running out of road, and yet we're getting a lot of warm words and not enough action. And I think young people are, you know, animated. They are mobilizing. The kids took to the streets to tell the politicians, get a grip. But we need to start acting. And I think until we do, people will feel anxious because this is massive. This is the biggest threat that we face. And our politicians across the piece are just not stepping up to it.
Madeline?
Well, I think there has been some very irresponsible language. I think it's been borderline millenarianism. It's doomsday stuff that we've been hearing. And from teachers, from activists, people who I think are not necessarily fulfilling their responsibility to their children, engaging in hyperbole on many, many occasions. And to be fair, that this kind of anxiety about the future is nothing new. I think children who grew up in the shadow of the Cold War probably felt something of this. And I remember in my childhood in the noughties, we watched films like An Inconvenient Truth, and we worried about rising sea levels, and we speculated about how long until Birmingham's going to be submerged under the sea and this kind of thing. So I don't think it's anything new, but it happens to have coincided with a particularly bad period of poor mental health for children and lockdown and a host of other things. So it is a real problem. It would be nice to see some dialling down of the language. And to those points about the government not doing enough, I mean, to listen to some of these contributions, you'd think that we weren't doing anything, when in actual fact we are doing a great deal that is going to put a lot of a lot of poorer people are really going to struggle to meet their bills, to pay for the cost of replacing things, the bans on certain types of car. I mean, there's an awful lot that is already having a very tangible impact on people's lives. And I really think people who think we should be moving a lot faster need to explain in concrete terms what that would do for people's lives, because we've not had enough of this specific conversation, I think.
Layla?
Well, there's plenty that we could and should be doing. Yes, we've done a lot, and much of it was started under people like Ed Davey when he was Energy Secretary, and the huge boom that we're seeing now in things like offshore wind farms is partly because of decisions he took then. So this has been happening for a very long time. But what we now realize is that it's not happening fast enough. And the language, and I think this is really infantilizing of children, which, you know, the word suggests, but it's not fair. We have to take them seriously. The language is coming from them. The letters that I've seen in my constituency surgeries have come from young children themselves, talking about how unless the politicians and the adults act, they are going to continue to try and campaign to get us to do more. So it's all very well patting ourselves on the back and saying, oh, we did well, well done you. Meanwhile, you know, there are more and more climate catastrophes happening across the world, and we are going to see this fundamentally shift the way that our ecosystems work. We have a chance to change this, and I am actually an optimist, even though I think I'm doing a bad job of getting that across. But I am an optimist, and there is more we can do. But I think, you know, saying to the government, well done you, isn't going to get them to do what's necessary. And that's what we're trying.
Madeline?
I mean, I don't know. I think that some of the language, for example, from people like Greta Thunberg suggests that governments are doing nothing, that they are sitting there and engaging in total inaction, when in fact we are spending a vast amount of money and possibly impoverishing swathes of society to get there. So this idea that we're doing nothing, which I think has been spread by children and is wrongly spread by adults, I mean, that is, I think, a mischaracterisation of the situation. And I could think of many more in a similar vein. Like, I think we need to have a less kind of doomsday type conversation.
Well, let me put Miata.
Yeah, so I think the issue is we're moving at a snail pace when we should be racing. And the frustration from young people is that they can see the crisis coming and they see that we're moving far too slowly. And I'll give you a classic example. You know, the government put some money into retrofitting homes, about 5 billion. We need about 3 times that. We need to be retrofitting and that's taking carbon out of our homes, about 19 million homes. What, you know, I would like to see in the next spending round is a big commitment to do that. We cannot decarbonise unless we do that. And yet the government is moving at a snail's pace. So it's not the fact that they're not acting at all, it's the fact that they're not acting at a scale and a pace that is commensurate with the scale of the crisis that we all agree we're facing.
All right, very briefly, Madeline.
Just say it's not the government that has to pay for this, it's taxpayers, and there needs to be some honesty about what that does to people's quality of life, to their bills, to their cost of living. we just talk about a cost of living crisis and about energy insecurity. And on the other hand, we're now having this conversation about how, we need to do further action in terms of climate change. And I'm very little about specifics, how we would pay for it and who's going to pay for it.
All right, I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to stick with this subject. I know, Leila, you want to come in and perhaps you can do so at the end of the discussion. But I just want to move on to something else that Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, said. He said, "We need some of the world's greatest brains and minds fixed on trying to repair this planet, not trying to find the next place to go and live." This was an implicit criticism about going into space. It really is quite crucial to be focusing on this planet rather than giving up and heading out into space to try and think of solutions for the future. Now, his comments, of course, come as the Hollywood actor William Shatner from Star Trek blasted off aboard the Blue Origin suborbital capsule developed by billionaire Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. You can see the pictures here. And Sir Richard Branson and Elon Musk are also building up space businesses. There they are, and there is the actor there coming down from space. Madeleine, do you think it was right, the Duke was right, in saying that we should focus on what's happening closer to Earth?
I have some sympathy because a lot of these space exploration entrepreneurs have a tendency to kind of talk very woolly talk about their green credentials and then meanwhile pump people into space. So I have some sympathy, but I'm not sure I fully agree in that I think when you do a big innovation like the move into the space race, for example, it often gives rise to all kinds of new technologies and inventions that you didn't imagine when you started out. Things like solar panels, for example, satellites, and transistors, all sorts of things have come as a result of this. So I would be quite wary of putting a dampener on new innovations because you might find that they give rise to something that helps us defeat climate change.
I will come to you. Leila, do you agree?
I actually do. I don't think that it should be either or. I think it's and. When we tap into that innate sense as humans of exploration and pushing at the boundaries of science. I mean, I'm a physics graduate. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I was watching what William Shatner was doing with enormous envy, frankly. But it's also true that Jeff Bezos, I don't think, pays enough taxes, or Amazon doesn't anyway. So I think it should be and I do think that what Prince William is trying to say, I agree with, which is that, let's take our eyes to what's really important right now, which is our planet. But I don't think we should be stopping people from boldly going somewhere else as well.
Oh, well done you for getting that in. Bim, should we focus more on the Earth rather than space? I'm
in danger of violently agreeing with everybody. I agree with both Madeleine and what Leila said. But to take on Prince William's comments more directly, I think that it's not just the planet, but it's also the people that live on the planet. And why I make that distinction is, as we make this push for net zero, we have to make sure that not only are people taken with us in a political sense, but that we make sure that the innovations and the new technologies, and because they're the things that are going to get us there. It's not politicians and governments, it's innovation and technology. Those things are done that make people's lives better. Because the danger of some of the talk that you hear from the sort of very, very doomsday scenario language, though I understand why people use it, is that people just say, well, it's all hopeless, and what we have to do is shut down everything, shut down all economic activity and go backwards. And I don't think, A, that that's a good outcome, and secondly, people just won't accept that. What we have to do is have to make sure that the net zero, low carbon world we build is better for people than the world we have now. And that's better in the broadest sense of that word.
Right.
So I think that unless we focus on the people as much as the planet itself, then we won't succeed in dealing with this problem.
Now, Miata, were you nodding away there? Is there more agreement?
There is violent agreement, so I do agree with him. And it is about the people and planet. The reason why organisations like my own at the New Economics Foundation, we call for a Green New Deal is that we want a pathway to net zero that will make people's lives better, that will create jobs, that actually realises the opportunities there are, because I think there are upsides and there are opportunities. But the thing I would say is that everything we've seen, all the analysis, everything that you'll hear from the experts, the scientists, is that pathway to a just transition, a transition that has the upsides, will not happen without proactive, deliberate government intervention. Yes, government working with industry. Yes, government working with technology and scientists. Yes, government working with communities. But unless there is a deliberate and proactive strategy to do it, it just won't happen. And when we look at our history and we look at moments of industrial transition, we have never done it where there isn't a proactive strategy to do it. And where I would go back to criticising the government is Again, lots of warm words. We have not seen action, and that is absolutely what we need to realise the very thing that Bim is saying. He's 100% right, but we don't get there by warm words. We get there by action.
Right, before we move on, yesterday on Politics Live, we discussed the issue of freedom of speech on university campuses. We talked about the case of Professor Kathleen Stock, an academic at the University of Sussex who has been accused of transphobia. Yesterday, we spoke to a student union officer at the university who said Professor Stock had signed a declaration which wants to eliminate trans people in law. Professor Stock has contacted us to point out that she supports the protection of gender reassignment, saying the text of the declaration she signed does not amount to the claim that trans people should be eliminated in law. She says, my arguments are about the precise legal form protections for trans people should take and how they interact with protections for other groups. I do not want to stop all teaching of trans rights or trans identities in British schools, and I have never said this. Now, we are hoping to speak to someone in Brighton, I think we have him, about the bin strike there, because we were showing you pictures in the headlines. I think we can show you more pictures. These are piles of rubbish that have been collecting on the streets of Brighton because of the strike there, because HGV drivers at Brighton Hove's City Clean, they are the company that the council uses to collect the bins and the rubbish. They're currently on strike over conditions and issues on routes and daily rotas. Let's talk to Mark Turner from the GMB union in Brighton. Mark, how long are you prepared to keep up the strike?
Well, we've balloted for further strike action. We've issued that to the council, and again, the current strike ends on Monday and then restarts again on Thursday, the 21st, for 30 days. Now,
why always Brighton at Hove? Because this isn't the first time this has happened, is it?
No, it isn't the first time. The issue here is in the way that the staff are being treated, and particularly drivers that are being removed from vehicles without the council management following their own internal procedures, not supplying the proper equipment, i.e. vehicles, and the council not following an ACAS agreement that we reached with them back in 2019.
Right, you say they're not being supplied with proper equipment. Is that up to the company or to the council?
Well, for correction, the service is run in-house by the council.
Right.
So it's the council not supplying those equipment, i.e. the vehicles. Now, they have authorised the funds over 3-4 years ago, but they've just not gone out and procured those vehicles.
All right. Now, look, the council says accepting your demands would cause catastrophic cuts in other services. Do you accept that?
No. We've never seen their justification from that. That's just words that they've put out, and we believe it may well be in a confidential report that they discussed yesterday, which I also understand it. There's no financial foundation to that, even to the political councillors that attended that meeting anyway. So I can't really answer that because they haven't justified that to us, even if that's the case.
All right.
But we question that anyway.
All right. Are your drivers being attracted elsewhere? High demand for them in the private sector? Wages rising?
They're in the area, yes. I mean, there's jobs in the city and the surrounding areas advertising for at least £10,000 to £11,000 more per annum.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, Mark Turner. Bim, listening to all of that, there's a danger here, isn't there? Public sector workers, especially HGV drivers, we've talked about it already on the programme, they're in high demand. They'll leave the public sector.
Well, look, the primary issue here is the really appalling management of the council. And this is what happens when you get so-called green council. Look at how green all of those bins
They're not here to defend themselves. But the issue here, as you heard from Mark, is also conditions, and they may be better elsewhere.
Well, there are advantages to working in the public sector over the private sector, and that is also vice versa true. People have a choice. In situations like this, I think it's incumbent upon the council to manage people incredibly carefully when there are shortages in the private sector, but also this time last year, we were going around talking about how difficult it was in the private sector. There was forecasts of 12-13% unemployment, and then everybody was flocking to the public sector, right? So actually, things can change very quickly. The important thing is that councils operate properly and manage services. That is their absolutely core function, and they shouldn't now use wider labour market problems as an excuse for their own failure.
Miata, I'm going to come to you, but I just want to show everybody this headline in The Independent. Sort of more broadly, many public sector workers considering quitting their jobs. That's according to TUC research.
Yeah, look, so I think it's really unfair to just blame the council because, you know, councils across the country have been trying to operate with year-on-year cuts that are still, by the way, coming. There is huge pressure on council services. There is huge pressure on their budgets. Any efficiency savings that could have been taken out have been taken out. So it's pretty grim out there. And many of them are just trying to balance all these tensions. But there is a real risk that if you keep kicking the public sector, if you keep not paying our workers, you know, the government's talking about we want a high-wage economy, quite rich when you don't pay your own workers what they should be paid for the valuable work that they're doing. If you have all of that as a backdrop, people will move away and they will leave. And we are so reliant on the public sector for so many things. You go back to the pandemic, those key workers that we all clapped, that we all said was vital for us to kind of survive and move forward as a society, they were in the public sector. And so we've got to value them, we've got to pay them and give them conditions, but it comes back to a set of decisions that are made at the national level that constrain the capacity of those at the local level to respond.
Right, Bim?
Well, of course we should cherish and strengthen where we can the public sector.
Yeah, but what about paying them more?
Well, we have protected public sector pay. We froze public sector pay for higher earning public sector workers, but it was risen for people at the lower end. I think that was the right choice to make. It's
£250 increase for those earning less than £24,000. Yes. There is a more general pay rise for NHS staff. Yes. Is that really enough, do you think, when you think about the groups of people that Miata was referring to?
It's a very difficult environment because ultimately, if you were to raise public sector pay by more, then that would come from taxpayers as well. So, you know, this isn't free money. It has to come from somewhere. The foundation for it all is a strong economy. That is generated in the private sector. Again, I come back to the point. A year ago, there was a huge flocking of people to the public sector because people were having such difficulties in the private sector. Now the private sector, to some degree, we're seeing catch-up pay to get to where they were pre-pandemic, and that will play out over time. And in a year's time or so, then when we come to the next round of public sector pay consultations, then we'll look at it at that moment.
Layla, do you accept Bim's argument? Difficult for the government to sort of keep pace with rising wages in the private sector?
But I think they're going to have to, because it's going to start affecting some of, you know, the very basics. And I'm a Liberal Democrat, so I talk a lot about potholes and bins, you know, and the reason why we do that is because that is what people notice. And when you start noticing that your bins aren't being collected and the potholes are getting bigger and the basic fabric of society is crumbling around you, actually that's going to bite the government in the bum eventually. So I think actually the thing that they should do is accept that councils are actually pretty efficient generally with how they spend money. Their amount of money that they get has been cut basically in half over the last 10 years. And I don't think that we are at the point now that they can take any more. At the same time, you've got a government saying pay your HGV drivers more. Well, it's the same people who've got HGV driving licenses who are driving our bins and they're going elsewhere. So I think at some point the government is going to, well, that's what the local contractor here locally has said, is that crisis has poached a lot of people out of bin driving locally, and we've had issues here too.
All right,
so what we absolutely need is to have the government give local councils the money to make services run well.
I'm going to interject because we haven't got that long, 45 seconds or so. Madeline.
Well, I would just say that, you know, all of this comes at a cost. And it is paid for by private sector workers who, on average, earn less than workers in the public sector, who have greater job insecurity, have been more likely to be laid off and so on during the pandemic, enjoy less extravagant pensions. And all of this has to be paid for. And I think that there needs to be some recognition of this, even if in some case it makes sense to have a pay rise.
Thank you to all of my guests today. And Alex Forsyth will be back here tomorrow at 12:15 with all the parliamentary highlights from across the UK in Politics UK. And I'll be back, of course, on Monday. See you then. Bye.